All right, so we're going to look at something, a possible alternate solution to our towers of Hanoi, and also revisit something we've talked about previously, something called an observer. Okay? Now, let me ask you this. I'm not necessarily saying this is the best solution, but is it a solution? If we had a scene, so this is a scene, if we had a scene for each different representation of the board, could we click from here to here, check to see if it was legal based on our table, and then move to that other scene for the new state of the board, the state that looks like this? Is that an unreasonable solution? Doesn't give us the cool animation, but it does give us a correct solution, does it not?
It does.
Okay. So I want to pause this one for a second. That way we don't have to keep, I can just hit play on a single scene. So I'm going to close this. We're going to create a new blank project. We're going to call this guy scene example. Okay, so we have our initial scene. Now, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to put we're going to call this guy an observer out here. Now, we're going to go into our scenes. I need to go back out here. And we're going to create another scene. So this guy will be, well, we'll call him the initial scene. And, well, we'll leave this guy as scene 1. Scene 1 will also get an observer. So both of these guys are going to have observers in them. All right. So we'll go back to the initial scene, which has our observer in there. And actually, just for the sake of argument, let's throw another actor out here. Actually, do I want to? Nah, we'll leave that off. Okay, we'll use the actor here in a few minutes. So we're going to have an observer. Now, this observer is going to have a local attribute that we're going to create. And we'll make it an integer. We're going to call this guy cur scene. And we'll start off at 0. Now, when we click on this actor, if we're currently in scene 0, we want to move to scene 1. Okay? So we want to transition between scenes using actors. So we'll create a rule inside of our observer. This actor receives a touch released will be click and unclick, right? So he receives a touch released thing, and what do we want to do? We want to change scene to which scene? Well, you can go to a specific scene or you can go to next or previous scene. We're going to do this based on what our current value is. So we need to throw another rule in here. We'll ask if this guy's cur scene is equal to 0. If that's true, then we're going to switch scene to scene 1. Else, we're going to change scene to initial scene. Okay? So if it's currently a 0, we're going to change to scene 1. Otherwise, we'll change to scene 2. And we'll leave it like that for right now. Right now, this guy has a instance variable. So we want to start talking about instance variables versus class variables. He has an instance variable that is a variable associated with this particular instance of observer called cursing that starts off at 0. When we click on this guy, if, and here just so we can tell the scenes apart, in the initial scene, we'll have this guy be red. And in scene 1, we'll have him be green. Okay, that's how we can tell the difference between which scene we're in. So now when we start this, we'll click. It'll say, okay, we did a touch and a release. Fine, we're going to switch scenes. Which scene are we going to switch to? If this particular instance's cursing variable is 0, we're going to switch to scene 1. Otherwise, if it's not 0, we'll switch to initial scene. So we'll start this. We click, it switches to scene 1. I click again here, it's still switching scenes, but it's switching to scene 1 over and over again because that guy has a variable of cursing is 0 still, correct? We'd really like cursing to be 1 when we're in here so we can toggle back and forth. So now it comes down to how do we solve that problem? Now, we'll start off with the question, well, we'll start off with maybe the easy solution. We could have a global variable called cursing, right? And that global variable can start off at 0, and as soon as we're switching to scene 1, we switch it back to a 1. So we can come in here and go to our game attributes. We can give this guy a cursing. Start off at 0. Now, inside of our observer, instead of checking our own cursing variable, we're going to check the global cursing variable, the one owned by the game. And if we move to scene 1 before we actually move to scene 1, we're going to change an attribute. That is, we're going to change the game's cursing to 1. Otherwise, if we're switching from scene 1 back to initial scene, we'll change it to 0. That makes sense? So we're doing the toggling at the global level. We run this, click, click, we can go back and forth between the two. Okay? Now, what we want to do is we want to figure out how do we become aware that we just entered the scene. So we want these observers, for instance, here's my initial scene. When I click here, forget about how we're actually accomplishing it right now, but when I click here and we move to our new scene, I want this guy to become aware that things just started. So what we need to look at is when does an actor in a scene become aware that the scene is now active? Does that make sense? Can this guy start doing things? So for instance, maybe, let's put inside of an observer a timer. So we'll throw a timer in here, and we'll say, after 5 seconds, what are we going to do? We're going to destroy ourselves, keeping us from getting back to the previous scene. Now, what we're also going to do, we're going to change this. It's not going to be called cursing right now. It's going to be called, let's call it time. No, this is in our actor, our attribute of our actor observer. So we're just going to rename that variable to time. We'll start off at 5. Now, we're going to teach this actor how to display that variable. So we'll display his time, the observer's time variable. And white should look fine on either red or green, I think, or at least fine enough. Now, the other thing we're going to do is inside of our timer, we're saying after 5 seconds, we're doing something. I'm going to create another timer. And this timer is going to count down. So we're going to say every 1 second, we're going to change an attribute. We're going to change this guy's time to whatever it currently is minus 1. Okay, so an observer is always displaying the current time. So it should start off at 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, and we should see that happen. Once it gets to 0, we are expecting that guy to destroy himself. That is no longer be clickable. So we can no longer get to the next scene. Okay, so when we start this, and we'll go ahead and start this real quick. You should see the countdown. Okay, now he's gone, can't get to the next scene. Okay, when we start this, we're going to wait till it gets to like a 2. Then we're going to click to get us to the next scene. What we're interested in is, does it start off as a 5 in the next scene? Or has it already been counting down? Does that make sense? When does the timer begin? So we'll wait till it hits a 2. It's 5, 4, 3, 2. So it started when the scene began. That makes sense? Whether you could see the text or not, I can see it on mine-ish. Okay? So a timer associated with an actor does not start until that scene becomes active. Interestingly, what if we restart this? I click here, it's at 5, let's let it get down to 2. Click here, it's at 5 again, let it get down to 2. Click here, it's at 5 again, let it get down to 2. The timer resets each time. Does that make sense? Now, question. Is it just the timer that's resetting, or is it the entire scene that's resetting? Well, what we can do is maybe every 5 seconds, or every 1 second rather, not only do the countdown, but let's move this guy to the right. That way we can notice whether his position resets. Does that make sense? I will do that check. So inside of our every 1 second thing, as we're counting down our time, we will also change this observer's position on X to be whatever it currently is, plus 30. Plus 50. We should be able to see some decent movement with that. Resets. So we get a fresh scene when we change the scene. Does that make sense? So that gives us some information about how we can use these scenes. Every single time we change to a scene, all the logic associated with that scene starts over. That's good for us, right? That way we can build logic into an observer, somebody who lives in a scene, that logic does not start. The game loop associated with that guy does not start until that scene becomes active. And it starts over every single time that scene becomes active. Actually, what happens is when a scene becomes active, it's a new instance of that scene. Brand new scene, even if you've been to that scene before. Okay, so when you leave a scene, the scene dies. Okay, so given that, do we kind of understand the current rules we're playing by? Okay, so we're going to get rid of all this crap. Now we're going to make a little experimental game, if you will, that's going to be related to this stuff. And then we'll revisit Towers of Hanoi in an assignment. By we, I mean you. Okay. Now, this is something I've been doing in one of the other classes, but we're going to give a little bit of a graphical twist to this. Let's say that we are creating a little dungeon crawler game. So this is the entrance. Our initial scene is the entrance to the dungeon, if you will, okay? Now, every dungeon, I'm going to get rid of our observer for right now. We'll throw things back in when we want to. Okay, and we'll get rid of that actor. Now, when we come into our initial scene, which is what we're in right now, this is our initial scene, we should have some number of exits shown to us. Okay? So we are going to keep this, we're going to start this off as being simple. We're going to create an actor called a door. Okay? And doors lead to other rooms, lead to the next room in our cave. Okay? Now, we'll set this up so when I click on this guy in our room number 1, it should go to scene 1, away from the initial scene. Okay? Now, so let's just go ahead and do that real quick. Well, actually, I'm going to just give ourselves a door actor, but I'm going to change the instance. That way we don't have to create 4 million door actors. Just each door leads to a different place, and we'll just edit each door individually. So I'll unlock this, and now we're going to change this particular instance of the door object. Okay? And we're going to create a rule, and this rule is going to say if this actor receives a touch release, then change scene to scene 1. Make sense? Now, go ahead and start this. Now we're in scene 1. There's nothing in scene 1. Okay? And we'll go ahead and we'll put in our scene 1. I'm going to create some treasure. Because as we're going through our cave, we find treasure, right? That's what we find in caves. Why else would you be in the cave? All right, so we're going to have treasure in here. So treasure, obviously, is gold in color, right? So there's our big honking pile of treasure in the middle of this barren room. Be careful, it might be booby-trapped. Okay? So now we're in the room with the treasure. Now, we can certainly put another door in here and say, go back to the original scene. But we're going to start practicing with instances versus class things. Okay? And I'll give you some more meaning to that once we get into an example. What I want to do here, not necessarily, well, this is similar to an Android device. How many of you run Android on your smartphones? Okay, how many of you run iPhone? Okay, there's one big difference between Android and iPhone with the user interface. And I mean, everybody's going to say there's a bunch of different differences. Android is designed around this concept of a back button. Okay? So you know wherever you are now, if you hit that back button, it goes wherever you just were. That makes sense? iPhone does not have an equivalent. Each application can write into that. They can put a back button in there and say, but Android, it's built into the device. Every single Android device has a back button built into it. Whether it's a software button on the screen or it's a hardware button somewhere on the device, it has a back button. That's part of the interface of Android. We want to have a back button here. And we want a back button, well, for right now, we want to have a back button here. And we want that back button to always take us to where we just came from. Which means we need to somehow remember where we just came from. That make sense? And not just remember it, be able to interpret it and go back there. How do we pull that off? What I don't want to do is I don't want to drop a door in scene 1 and say go back to initial scene. I want to accomplish this. So I'm going to show you what I want to happen, but we cannot do it the way I'm about to do it. I want that to happen. Go into the room in the cave. Eventually, I want to be able to grab my treasure and get credit for it, right? Why go into the cave and see all this treasure and not leave with it? Everybody knows that works out every single time in the Indiana Jones movies. Whenever Indy brings somebody else with him, and the guy sees some treasure, he tries to pick it up, that guy always dies. Never remove treasure from the cave, right? But we're going to do it because we're hogs. Okay, but we want to have a way of going back. But right now I have this guy just responding to an event and going directly where we want to go. I want to be able to create a bunch of rooms and always be able to go to wherever I just came from. Go ahead.
If you had like the back button on top, couldn't you just have like go to previous scene?
That was an option. Yeah.
Okay. So you want this, which I'm also going to say you can't do, but we'll go ahead and do it.
Come on.
Okay, so this is your back button. And instead of the initial scene, you want to say go to previous scene. Okay, fine. Yeah, we can't do that. We want to emulate what that's doing. Somehow that's remembering where we just came from. Actually, I don't think that's necessarily true. I really don't. Let me prove that to you real quick. If I go to initial scene, and here I'll just throw another door out here, and we'll edit this door, and we'll say if this guy receives a touch released, change scene, previous scene, and we run this, it wraps around your scenes. It doesn't necessarily remember where you just were. Does that make sense? Because I was never in this scene. Game just started. Does that make sense? It's going through your scenes in order.
Backwards.
Well, backwards or forwards, depending. Well, always backwards if you say previous scene, but you get what I'm saying. It treats your list of scenes as if I'm here and you say previous scene, it wraps around to this guy. If I'm here and I say previous scene, it goes here, so on and so forth. Okay? But we want this guy, this door, to go back wherever we came from. Because we're going to have lots of rooms in our cave. And we want to always remember where we came from so we can go back there. Okay? As opposed to, I mean, the more realistic version of this, if you're in a cave and it takes all these twists and turns and you're in a room that has 3 different exits and you get all turned around, you might not remember where you just came from. Right? That's the way of getting lost. Well, we might implement that in eventually, but right now we want to know, we want this guy, this scene, to become aware of where we just came from so he can take us back there. That make sense? How do we pull that off? Go ahead.
Could you give this scene a variable, and if you click a forwards door, it adds one, and if you click go back door, it subtracts one?
Okay, so you want the individual scene to have a variable.
I don't know if it would be the individual scene or if it would be a global variable.
But also,
Well, if you need every scene to have access to it, it would have to be a global variable. Scenes only have access to their own variables. Go
and
ahead.
also if you had more than 3 scenes, that might not work.
Well, you could have it instead of adding and subtracting, you could have it set it to whatever the scene number was that you was
Yeah.
from.
Okay.
So then to go back with run through a list of or check the scene value and then go to whatever scene.
Okay. So if I'm in scene 1 right here, we see that this scene has a name, and the name is scene 1. If I'm going to change scenes, let's go back to the just use this guy real quick. Change scene only lets me choose from existing scenes or next and previous scene. I can't say, go to the scene named this.
If it was so if this door not only changed the scene but also changed the global variable to this is initial scene, so make it the number 0. Then when you're in another scene, you have to go back, it would check whatever that value was, and then go to whatever scene you assigned.
Okay, so you'd have a big if statement that says, if the scene you should go to, if previous scene is scene 1, change scene 1. If previous scene is initial scene, change to initial scene. If previous scene is scene 4, change to scene 4. Okay.
Or a table.
Yep.
A table.
Table might make more sense, but still the same problem. A table, you would have the benefit of being able to say, here's all the places I've been, and being able to walk back up it. Okay? All right. So we could have a big monolithic if statement. Do we like those?
No.
We don't like monolithic if statements. If we do that, the bigger our cave gets, the more complex that one if statement gets, right? We end up having a situation where we have 200 rooms in our cave, and that means the previous room could be one of any of those, well, one of 199 rooms. That is the rooms we're not currently in. Go ahead.
Could we have 2 global variables and then have each scene have its own scene number? And then as you set the new scene, set the old scene to what that old scene was, or set the old scene to what the screen was, and then a new scene to what the screen should be. It's like the previous scene.
But that's keeping track of where we should go, but how do we get there? I mean, that's really no different than what he suggested, where, I know I want to go to scene 1, but ideally we want to just say change scene to the scene named 1 instead of this 199 if statements that say, well, if it's scene 1, go here. If it's scene 2, go here. If it's scene 3, go here. Go ahead.
Can't we do this with every door? So you have your rule when you touch it, it goes to a certain scene. So you just do that with every door and set it to that previous scene.
Okay, so every door is a link between 2 scenes.
Yeah.
So if we know where a door goes, it's going to have a corresponding side of the door, right? So in a house, well, take this door right here. If we are in this room, this door knows about us, but it also knows what's on the other side of it. It knows the previous room, if you will. Okay, so since we're doing each door as a one-off, can each door know what scene it should return to? So we're building, that would be an example of a data structure. We're building the logic into the actors. Rather than keeping this global storage of everything that's happening inside of our entire game, which we can do, right? We can use tables, or we can put 400 variables up there at the global level, keeping track of all this different stuff that's going on. Realistically, what we're saying is if we're standing in one room, if we're in this room, I have 2 doors I can go through. If I go through this door, it's going to go back to whatever room's out there. If I go through that door, it's going to go back to whatever room's out there. So we can build that logic into the doors themselves. So every door knows where it should go back to. So our cave becomes self-governing. Does that make sense? Room 64 doesn't necessarily know about the exits in room 3. But you can traverse through our cave using all those rooms and get there. Okay, so we already have this guy set up to say, if I click him, go to scene 1. And that'll take me into scene 1. Isn't this a door? And this guy says, go back to initial scene. Isn't that what we said we didn't want to do? It works. But is there a way? So the point is, there's nothing wrong with that solution. It was a nice, quick solution, did exactly what we wanted to do. What we want to discover is there a way for us to remember where we just came from, so that we can go back there without having to have, I want to have that equivalent to the Android back button. No matter where you are in the Android operating system, if you hit that back button, it takes you back to wherever you just came from. Well, what are other behaviors we have in here? Let's see if anything looks of interest.
Save attribute that help us with tables at all?
Well, tables are kind of a replacement for variables. So we can certainly save things. But
If we were gonna hard code it, that might be bad.
well, definitely, if we wanted to keep track of our entire cave structure, you definitely want to do that in the table rather than adding a new attribute for every single room you put in there. We started today talking about the difference, talking about these observers and who becomes aware of who. Okay? If we have an observer in this room and he knows about the room he's in, and then we have another observer, let's go to our next room. Here's our observer. We'll take the door out for right now. Put the treasure over in the corner. So we have an observer here and we have an observer here. Okay? These guys are both observers, but they're individual instances of the observer class. So it's kind of like a cricket referee. These are two separate cricket referees. They both are referees. They both know the rules of cricket, but they're separate people. I want an observer to know. So let's put the onus on the observer themselves. I want the observer to know what room we're currently in and what room we just came from. So let's start with that logic. So if I'm an observer, we'll get rid of our time variable here. We'll just index our rooms. So we'll say cur room is room 0. And then we're going to have prev room is room -1, meaning we were not in a previous room. Make sense? Okay. Every single observer, when they first come into existence, they have those two variables, and it's initially set to 0 and initially set to -1. I want this guy, right now we only have 2 rooms, so we can make this example pretty simple. This guy who's in the initial scene, he does not have a previous room right now. But when we click to the next scene, this observer now knows I am in scene index 1, not 0. And my previous scene is 0, not -1. I want these two guys to somehow be able to communicate with each other. Go ahead.
Oh, to communicate with 2 observers?
Well, these are 2 separate observers, but they both have the same job. How does the first observer somehow let the second observer, forget about who tells who. How does the second observer become aware that he is in room 1 and the previous room, the way we got here is from room 0?
Could we add, when you do the if statement to change, could you just add it in there? Like, cur room equals cur room plus 1, and then same thing with prev room. Because when you click the door, then it's going to move to the next room, so you're going to add 1 and then add 1. So then now your current room's at 1 and your prev room's at 0.
Okay. I think I get what you're saying. So because we recognized already that this guy, that an observer, doesn't start his logic until a scene starts, couldn't we say, let's just do it in the,
Well, you already have it in the door, don't you?
yeah, but we just want to do it in the observer because I'm having to display some stuff. So we're going to go to the prototype for our observer. And our observer is going to always display some stuff in black. He's going to display text. He's going to display his cur room dot his previous room. And let's put like how about a colon, another dot. So that'll be cur room colon previous room. That's the syntax this guy should have.
Do you need the char symbol in there then?
We might. I'm not sure if we do or not. Single quotes. Well, actually, we can just do double quote and it'll definitely work. So if we do that, we can actually put a space. Oh, it doesn't let us do spaces. Nice. Okay. And we want to make this black text. So this is the initial scene. This should be 0, -1. When we come here, we want it to say 1 and 0. That's what we'd like to happen. Go ahead.
When we have the door change in the room, we have to change the global variable to whatever the previous scene number is, and then when we go into the next room, the previous scene number of that actor changes to the global variable. Wait, no, that doesn't fix that problem.
Well, what he was suggesting is we build into observer a change attribute. This is an action. Happens exactly one time. And he wants to change.
That's a constraint.
Oh, but I said the right thing, right?
Yeah.
All right, good. Change attribute. You want to change this observer's cur room from whatever it currently is +1. We might have to go back and rethink what we started off as. Similarly, we're going to start our observer's prev room. We want it to be one bigger than it used to be. And maybe we start cur room off at -1 and prev room off at -2. So at the very first time, they go to 0 and -1. Okay? So every single observer knows how to display its current room and previous room numbers, separated by a colon, and it also, as a one-off, changes those values by 1. So when we first start this, we see our 0 and our -1. We go here, it didn't change.
Aren't those variables not global yet?
Yeah, we don't want them to be global. Oh, okay. I understand what you're saying. So it did change. This is what he's saying. When I went from here, it went from a -1, -2 to a 0, -1. When I went here, it changed again. Still, exact same thing happened. We saw this occur, but we really need it to happen twice for this guy. So you want to make him global. Well, if I make it global, how does this guy remember where he came from? If I change it globally, won't the previous guy, won't he lose track of where he is? How do I get these two actors talking to each other between scenes? Go ahead.
You have a global variable, and then each individual scene in the instance change a variable in the instance to what the global variable was, and that would store it because it's in the instance.
It's not a global variable, but a private variable set to.
What are we going to do to the global variable then?
It would just stay whatever.
Okay, so tell me what you want to set the initial global variable to. Let's just do this on cur room. Let's just do it on one of the variables. We'll do it on both, fine. So game, attributes, what do you want to...
We just have a global variable of like 1.
What do you want to call it?
I don't care.
That's a good name. IDC. I don't
What does
care.
it represent?
IDC.
What does this global variable represent for you? You're using it to try to communicate between two actors, correct? What do you want to call it? Facilitator? I don't know if I can spell that. Facilitator. Did I spell it right?
Yeah,
All right.
close enough.
What do you want to start off at?
1.
All right. So that guy's a 1. Okay. What are we going to do with them?
Going to the observer.
Okay.
The instance, right?
This well. Oh, you want to do it in an individual instance?
Yeah.
Well, that kind of breaks things.
Because it,
You also change the attribute in the attribute.
So you want to go in and you want to change this guy directly instead of the prototype.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll humor you for now. Go ahead.
So then, let's
So he does have his pre-room. Actually, interestingly enough, pre-room and cur room. So I unlock those. And how are you going to use that facilitator?
change self-program to the facilitator +1.
Okay, well, you start a facilitator off at, here, I'll just get rid of the pre-room. You start a facilitator off at 1, correct?
Yeah.
Now this guy, he's in room 0, correct? So really our facilitator should start off at 0. And then this observer is going to set his cur room to the facilitator. And then what's he going to do? Probably change facilitator to be +1. Because the next cur room is going to be.
Yeah.
Okay. Question is, will this change this? We'll see here in a second. Leave that alone. So we'll change attribute. We're getting very close to the correct answer here. It's one of those things close but so far. So we'll change our games facilitator. I know we're on our last minute here. Let me just finish it up real quick. +1. Forget about the -2 thing. So this guy starts off at a 0, then it became +1. When we clicked our next screen, this guy's meaningless right now because he's only using his local variables. What we'll start off next time doing, and somebody remind me, put the same logic in here as we just did previously. We just did in the previous guy. Then what would happen if we put that in the instance, the prototype, rather than the individual instances? Does that make sense? Will moving the facilitator allow us, since these are actions and only occur once, will allow us to do the communication.